Western Washington.
Okay, so
is where my mom's family was.
and because that was a stronghold of the logging industry.
Exactly. Yes, I think it was just more remote. There were, it was, as I say in the play, it was mostly men who were there to log.
Right.
And it was pretty harsh living conditions for quite a while.
For some reason, I'm thinking McCabe and Mrs. Miller. I'm thinking
yes,
right? That town.
Totally. That town. Yeah.
Yeah. But
but her family was amazing too.
Sure.
I mean, my grandma happened to marry a really bad man, but part of the working on the play, that was one of the myths. There were many sort of things I unlearned while making the play. And one of them was like the myth of the one bad man, right? Where I sort of grew up being like, oh, if only that bad man hadn't come into my
That's weird. I was just going to say that.
Family's life.
So what is that myth? The myth is that all it takes is one bad man to set a history of repetitive, a legacy of repetitive abusive relationships.
Yes, that. And then I also think that the one bad man is somehow a lone figure, not
part
divorced from a larger culture of male violence, divorced from a larger culture of laws that don't protect people from that kind of violence, divorced from centuries of Western law that that says you can beat up and kill your wife. It was sort of like I really started to see him as a symptom. And then I think because of the focus of the show, also just a person enabled by laws to take out his violence on children and take out his violence on, you know what I mean? Like that the law, I think in some ways continues to enable that and had for centuries.
And that's the macro, but the micro is still the one bad man.
The micro is still the one bad. Yeah. She ended up with the wrong person. Yeah.
And it happens all the time. I think that a lot of the statistics that you cite and the way you sort of capture in the show, how does this negligence happen? When you kind of share in the show those bits and pieces of those proceedings in past Supreme Courts, where these men are clearly uncomfortable and having arguments over semantics when there's really lives in the balance, shows, a disconnect, an empathy, there's no empathy there. And I think is the point that they can't see how their policies are making it dangerous, specifically for, women and people of color.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. That was the thing that struck me the most when I listened. I listened to hundreds of hours of Supreme Court cases, and particularly in the case you're talking about, which has to do with an abusive man. I was just shocked at how dissociated the judges seemed from their own feelings. You can sort of hear it in their voices as they sort of ramble on, like, does shall mean shall? I don't know. Sometimes it means shall, sometimes it means this. And the meanwhile, at the center of this case is a painful, horrific story that they've just stopped
talking about. Yeah.
And I think right now, as we're having apparently this national debate over whether the Constitution is a living thing or a dead thing, I feel like this idea that you could interpret law without keeping the living human beings at the center of your argument and keeping them
right
in your mind and in your heart as you're making these decisions.
But I think but it feels like that disconnect goes like that. That disconnect applies to the Senate. It applies to the leadership and power, that everybody sort of seems to be insulated in their job and in their bubble and in whatever numbers they're fighting for, that there are these broad ideas around, fiscal support and fiscal responsibility that really come down to numbers without really having stories attached to them. Right.
Right.
But that case, that was just insanity, that it's really about a woman who had a restraining order on her husband, who then took the kids, killed them, and she wanted recourse, for the police not defending or prosecuting the restraining order. And that, and that argument that you have from the Supreme Court is about whether there was a constitutional responsibility on behalf of the police department to protect that woman and her children. And they decided no. Yes, that was the decision. And that's fucking nuts.
I agree. I 100% agree that it's fucking nuts.
But that was the issue of originalism, right? Yes. And intent. So that.
Yes.
Yeah, the way you sort of flesh out the kind of negative rights, positive rights, and all that stuff, I wouldn't have known any of that, and I could have went to my grave not knowing that, and now I know it, and and I find it. I think that like when you're my age and you learn these things, you're sort of like, oh wow, that really changes everything in the way I think or understand things. But I think more importantly, the show may sort of instigate younger people to realize, like, I got to get involved with this shit.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. It certainly made me feel that way. Like, I think even the grown-ups on the show have all become more politically active just because of the things we all learned while making the show. I knew nothing about positive rights or negative rights. I honestly only learned about that because of that case. I listened to that case so many times and I was like, I don't understand. This makes zero sense to me. She went to the police, like 14 times in one night and said, my husband has my children. Will you please go look for them? And they were like, go home, lady. You're being dumb, Right. And the fact that she could not sue that police department is, I just couldn't fathom how our laws work. So that's when I asked a friend who knew a constitutional scholar to hook me up. And I said, can I just please take you out to dinner? And can you just explain to me? And it was a very long dinner because it's very confusing. But that's when I first learned about positive rights and negative rights.
The two types of constitutions.
The two types of constitutional rights. And, and that's when I learned that all modern constitutions, ours is the oldest one still in use. It's really an antique. Most other constitutions were made after the 20th century, and they all contain positive rights, which are like affirmative rights that say the government has to, protect you. It has to provide basic things like healthcare and a certain standard of living. It has to protect people it has to protect minorities. Like it has gender protections in it, has racial protections, ability protections. And a lot of them contain clauses that say that you have a right to clean air and water, that you have a right, that it's the government's duty to look after the environment. And I was just sort of gobsmacked. I had no idea.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, like, even knowing that all that stuff is proactive and good, that this country seems to be wrestling with the ideas like we can bend our old document. We will, instead of like evolving that, why not just bend this society back to the 1700s?
Right.
Without taking into consideration that most of the government has been turned out by corporate pimping, and that, all you're going to end up with if you do that explicitly is fascism. So
yeah,
that's really what's going on now.
I agree with you. And
there's enough dum-dums to be like, but what about liberty? Oh, shut the fuck up. I'm sorry. Anyway.
No. I feel like the notion of liberty has really gotten twisted.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we have a right to spread plague.
Right.
Don't tell us what to do. You're not the boss of me. Whereas a positive rights constitution be like, we are kind of the boss of you, and it's public health. So
yeah, or we have. I feel like when I think of that kind of constitution, I think of the idea that I feel like the statement it's making is that we're all responsible to one another.
I know you would think that people would get the hang of that, but see, like, the nature of capitalism and the free market has twisted everything up and mind fucked so many people. It's all very calculated on some level, right?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
I think people have lost their way. And that's reinforced by the representatives of malignant business interests. But I think we're getting away from, why you went to Siberia and how you get. So when but But I think what's interesting to me when I was thinking about, how this evolved for you is that, this was not, what you set out to do. You set out to be an actor.
Yes.
And,
and a writer.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And this sort of evolved because, you've been working at it. Like, when did you start? You started acting in Seattle.
I started acting. Yes. I actually started acting when I was a kid. My mom had a Shakespeare company for kids called the Short Shakespeareans.
Really?
Yes. It still exists, actually. She handed it over to an amazing woman, and it's been going now for almost 40 years.
Children's theater is great.
Yeah. So I got to play, she of course cast me in all the lead roles. So I got to play all the great Shakespearean heroines between the ages of 6 and 12. I really cut my teeth on the best.
That's some heavy shit.
Actually, we only did the comedies. We didn't do Macbeth or anything.
You didn't do Lear? I'd like to see a 6-year-old.
I would actually like to
That'd be great.
That too.
With some 6-year-old kid with a beard doing that last monologue.
It would probably be quite moving, actually.
It would be great.
That's a really good idea. I feel like you're pitching a lot of excellent ideas
Run with them.
today.
Run with them.
Yeah, I'm going to. I got to earn that money. So I did that as a kid, and then I acted in college. And then, yes, when I took a little detour, I spent a couple of years in Russia.
What is that about? Who does that? So you're in college for what?
I double majored English and theater with a minor in Russian language. Because I really liked, I loved Dostoevsky. It was my favorite.
Sure. And you wanted to be able to read it in Russian? I
did want to be able to read it in Russian. And I thought it was a beautiful language. I also kind of grew up obsessed with Russian dancers, particularly Baryshnikov.
Sure.
Who was a big crush.
So you had a plan.
So I had a plan to meet Baryshnikov.
In Russia.
I still haven't met him, although I've met now his daughter, who's a wonderful actress. I've actually never confessed to her. I'm sure she knows all the women my age had huge crushes on her father, but I've never talked to her about it.
Misha, right?
Anna, Misha.
Yeah.
Misha. Yeah, I watched The Turning Point. Over and over.
But also Russia has, a long history of theater and film and have made, despite, whatever horrors they were responsible for governmentally, they definitely changed theater, and they changed film, and they changed dance.
Yes.
There's definitely a totalitarian work ethic, I guess, that really delivers the goods.
I think the work ethic. I also think, the spirit of creating art in the face of probably all of that horror. That was. But yeah, they changed. I mean, they invented acting as we know it. I loved living there. I lived in Siberia for a year, a little tiny town called Tinda, and then I moved to St. Petersburg.
You love Siberia? I feel like that you don't see that bumper sticker a lot. I heart Siberia. What? What was it like there?
It was so unbelievably beautiful. I lived in this place called Tinda on this river called, there's this amazing lake called Baikal, which is like the largest. It's like a lake that's like an ocean, which is one of the most incredible places on earth. And then I lived on this Amur River. And, when I first got there, everything was covered in snow and ice. And then spring came and everything melted. And it was just the birch trees and the river and the miles of steppe, I guess you call it.
Yeah.
It was one of the most physically beautiful places I've ever been.
And how's your Russian?
It's okay. So my brother followed me there, and he was a journalist in Moscow for 10 years. And now he lives in Prague with his family and his wife, who's Russian. And so my niece and nephew speak Russian, and they I thought my Russian was still really good, but they just mock me mercilessly when I try to speak. They imitate my accent. And so I guess it's not that good.
How many siblings